I'm Shemen Keitner, and it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest, Sharon Abraham-Weiss. Sharon is the Executive Director of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, Israel's oldest and largest human rights organization. ACRI is the only organization that deals with the entire spectrum of human rights and civil liberties issues in Israel and the occupied territories. Sharon began her career at ACRI as a staff attorney in 2001. After 7 years in that role, she worked for the Israeli government as the Tel Aviv and Central Israel region's Equal Employment Opportunity Commissioner, a position she held for 5 years. In 2012, she was a Wexner Fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where she earned her master's in public administration. She returned to ACRI in May 2014 as executive director. In 2005, Sharon was featured in The Marker newspaper as one of the top 10 most influential people working for social change in Israel. And she's consistently recognized as one of Israel's most prominent women leaders. Tonight, she joins us for a conversation about human rights and civil rights in Israel and the occupied territories, and what ACRI is doing to build a society that respects the dignity and equality of all human beings. Please join me in welcoming Sharon Abraham-Weiss. So, Sharon, we're really delighted to have you here in San Francisco at the tail end of what's been a whirlwind U.S. tour. And I'd love to talk to you about the organization that you've worked for so long. But before we do that, I'd love to tell our audience a little bit more about you personally and your own background and how you came to this kind of work.
So it's actually, my mother is coming from Poland, so we're Holocaust survivors. My father comes from India, where he grew up in a Christian family. I grew up in Eilat, which is the south of Israel, the periphery, in low-income family. So I think with this background, it's not a big surprise that I'm dealing with human rights and minorities.
And ACRI is, as I mentioned in the introduction, the oldest human rights and civil rights organization in Israel. It was founded in 1972, and I understand that the U.S. ACLU was an inspiration for its creation. So tell us a bit about ACRI.
ACRI was founded by North American Jews who came to Israel who wanted to bring liberal ideas. So pretty much we are the equivalent for the ACLU. In some cases we do work with them. And as you mentioned before, it's a broad spectrum. So we are not a niche organization. We're dealing with all the variety of human rights and defending minorities in Israel.
You know, as we were talking just before this program began, one of the things that you mentioned is, like the ACLU, one of your roles is to challenge actions by the government. And ACRI has found itself over the years challenging actions by both left-wing governments and right-wing governments. Right. So it sounds like maybe all governments find you somewhat irritating.
You know, when you're defending minorities, it's hard to be popular because you're the minority, and we try to get a wide view of the society in Israel and to mark, to find the fields where groups are being marginalized and to promote them.
So I'd love to hear, before we get to ACRI's work today on a number of the most pressing issues in Israeli society, about some of those landmark cases that it fought over the years, some of the victories that you have found particularly significant.
Oh, so there are many of them. We are 43 years old, and the main way we act is the legal. We have a big legal department. We operate also in education and in public outreach. But when I'm thinking about landmark cases, so there is a case from 1994 where we promote women's rights. So there was this woman who wanted to be a pilot in the Israel Defense Forces, and this is an interesting story because she was a new immigrant from South Africa, and she was actually holding a pilot's license. But when she came to the IDF and she said, I want to be a pilot, they told her women cannot be pilots. And we appealed, and we got lots of criticism over it. Why do we go against the government, the regime? And we ended up getting a verdict that was speaking about women's role in the job market in general and about equality. And I think it's a landmark case in terms that promoted women in general. So I think if you look at Israel today, women are enjoying fair, not total equality. We still have the 30% pay gap, like many other countries, like in the US, for example, but which I'm not content with, don't get me wrong, but I think it made a big difference. Other case that I'm looking at is the minority of Arab Israelis. For example, we have a landmark case from 2000 named Ka'adan about land allocation for the Arab minority within Israel. And it's an important case speaking about the Arab minority and its right to equality.
So when we're talking about court challenges, which is something, of course, we're quite familiar with in the United States, which is somewhat known for being a litigious society. In our system, of course, a big role of the ACLU in minority rights protection is looking to the U.S. Constitution and looking to the guarantees in the Bill of Rights and making sure that legislation, for example, comports with those guarantees. Can you just give us a little primer on what are the kinds of legal guarantees or the sources of legal guarantees that ACRI is enforcing in Israeli courts?
So the first lesson in law school is called constitutional law, which is quite interesting because Israel does not have a constitution. So how do you deal with it, right? So we have laws that are called basic laws that are above regular laws. One day when there will be a constitution, these will be part of the constitution. So we are using, in what we call constitutional law, we use those basic laws. We inherit the legal system from the British mandate that was in Israel and all the region before Israel was established in 1948. So basically within Israel, as it was defined in 1948, we're using constitutional law and regular law. Now in 1967, Israel occupied what is known today the occupied Palestinian territories, which is a different story because this is occupied territory. So the law that applies over there is international humanitarian law. And it's a different system than the democratic system within Israel, because within Israel we have citizens, 20% of them are Palestinian Israeli citizens or Arab Israeli citizens, and these are equal citizens like me. But in the occupied territories, they're refugees. It's a different story, and the law in Israel does not apply to them.
So I thought it was interesting because I asked you earlier how you self-identify when we were speaking, and you said, well, it's Israeli. I said, well, why don't you say Jewish Israeli? Because we talk about Arab Israeli, so why don't we talk about Jewish Israeli? And you had an interesting reflection on that.
As a majority, it's I don't need to define it because this is the default. So even being familiar with American Jews, for example, I don't have to celebrate or to go to shul on Friday because it's there. My kids do not go to school on Saturday because this is the day that the shops will be closed. On Yom Kippur, everything will be closed. I don't have to do the act. And by default, when you're the majority, there are things that you don't think about it, while minorities needs to define themselves, otherwise their collective identity will disappear.
So it is interesting, as you mentioned, with the borders of Israel drawn as they are, there are 20% of the population, roughly, that are Arab Israelis, that have full citizenship rights on paper, but that I understand your organization has been very active in ensuring that those rights on paper are actually translated into practice. As you mentioned, there are also the occupied territories, and again, just so that we get a sense of the demographics here, there are not only Palestinians living in those occupied territories, yes. Right?
Today, there are around 2.5 million Palestinians in the occupied territories. I refer mainly to the territories that are known also as Judea, Samaria, or West Bank. This was part of Jordan in 1967. There's also Gaza Strip, which is a different story, close to Egypt. But today, in the occupied territories, there are Jewish settlements. Nearly 400 Israeli Jews live there.
400,000.
400,000, yeah. Sorry, of course, 400,000 Israelis live there, and it's a different system of law, as I said, but just to give you the sense, because due to international law, the rule that applies in the occupied territories was the Jordanian rule in 1967, so it's different courts. So if you and I stole, God forbid, from the same grocery store, and I'm a Jew and you're a Palestinian, will go through two different systems. I will be tried according to the Israeli law, and you will be tried according to Jordanian law. So it's very complicated. It's not, if I'm speaking within Israel about the rule of law in democratic way, the rule in the occupied territories is different.
It does certainly sound like a good law exam question in terms of the choice of law in the occupied territories. But let's talk about the democracy of Israel and the basic law that applies. And I know one of the rights that ACRI has been very passionate about advancing and defending is the right to freedom of expression, which is obviously a right that we hold very dear in the United States as well under the First Amendment. And I understand that ACRI and other organizations have been very concerned about potential limitations on the freedom of expression. Tell us a little bit about what your concerns are and how ACRI has tried to address them.
So there are a couple of things. The idea in democracy that you're supposed to have a flourishing civil society, and people can express themselves. It doesn't matter what are their views, as long as we're not speaking about hate speech or recitation. And so this is the idea about democracy, because if you have only single voice, you don't call it democracy anymore. And we were feeling, especially recently, that there are constraints on freedom of expressions. And I'll give you an example what was bothering us. Last year, there was a war in 2014, known also as Protective Edge Operation. And this was on the Gaza border, while there were lots of violations of human rights in terms of humanitarian law. And we have a department that deals with humanitarian law over there. But we were worried about things that were happening in Israel as a democracy, because when people criticize this war on their Facebook pages, for example, there are other people calling to fire them from the workplaces. So we experienced a situation where views that were criticizing the government were not accepted. We're also worried, I have to say we didn't get that, but I left Israel nearly 2 weeks ago. So as for the current events, I'm reading the papers and I'm speaking with my staff every morning. But still, I'm not on the ground. But a couple of things really bother us now when we see leaders and officials saying not to allow people to demonstrate or express themselves against the situation. And the freedom of expression should be for everybody, even if I don't like their views. I guess some of you are familiar with the ACLU dealing with Skokie a long time ago when neo-Nazis wanted to march. And it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to hear views that you don't like. But this is the idea of democracy, that you have to let other people speak because you want to be able to speak up for your values as well.
Well, it makes me think of, in the United States, of course, we have, still have detention at Guantanamo Bay, and there was a period during which there was a lot of litigation related to that, and a number of attorneys, as you may know, on a pro bono basis, volunteered to go and represent Guantanamo detainees in a variety of proceedings. And they did experience, many of them, sort of being singled out afterwards, being threatened with professional repercussions in the United States for their participation in what we understand in the United States to be an essential component of the criminal justice system, which is the right to defense, right? So it does seem what you said earlier about being unpopular, it's almost the people who play those unpopular roles that are the most important in maintaining the system of values that we associate with democracy.
We're having, I'll give you an example that we're experiencing now. So we have administrative detention. It means that people are being detained without trial. We argued for many years that this is illegal, and it was mainly against Palestinians. Today, there are 400 Palestinians in the occupied territories in Israel that are being detained this way. Now, our argument is that there is the rule of law and legal system. If you want to detain somebody, you should go to court and and use the regular due process. Now it's being used against right-wing Jewish settlers as well. And the idea, we are looking at both sides of the spectrum, saying Palestinians and right-wing Jews, neither of them should be administratively detained. This is illegal as a system. You want in a democratic system to be able to have a due process for people.
Well, it's interesting because the choice of title for tonight's session, which I'm not sure if you had anything to do with it or not, but in terms of safeguarding the future really made me think of that, because as I learned more about the work of your organization, it seemed that so much of what you're doing really is trying to shore up these basic institutional mechanisms, these checks and balances that, again, from this side of the ocean, we have a tradition of understanding as critical to the strength of any country, but that I understand, in Israel, in a country that is surrounded by non-democratic states, democracy sometimes seems something aspirational, almost naive to aspire to. Do you get that criticism?
We get this criticism, that's right, but the question is, what is the character of the country you want to live in, whether you are going to give up on your democratic values and say, okay, this is the neighborhood, tough luck, or you're going to say, we insist. And I think we're being challenged as a society in hard days. It's easier to sit in an air-conditioned room in good times and to speak about democracy in a lab. It's harder to do it in practice. And it is hard. My family live in Tel Aviv, and the fear of people is genuine, but does it allow, can we justify collective punishment for others because of this fear? For me, the answer is clear, which is no. And all the modern attitude towards human rights, if I'm looking at Declaration of on Human Rights, it was post-World War II, when my people were the victims. And when these documents were composed, it was to defend refugees and minorities, that it won't happen again to anybody. And I think we have, as human beings, to be consistent with this. And sometimes it's really hard, especially when the public opinion is against. And sometimes you can't blame the public. It's really hard to think equality when you're being threatened in many ways, and it's a genuine feeling of feeling uncomfortable with things. On the other hand, you always have to think about yourself from the other side as well. And I think the democratic character of Israel is really important. Something else that we experienced recently was the freedom of expression of art and culture. So we have a new minister of culture who would like to minimize the freedom of culture. So there were a couple of incidents in the past couple of months that we were concerned about. So there was a film that was supposed to be filmed in the Jerusalem Film Festival about Yigal Amir, who's the person who assassinated the Prime Minister Rabin in 1995, 20 years ago. And the minister decided that it's not a good idea to show it. Now, it's not that I identify with this person, not at all, don't get me wrong, but I think it's important to learn and to see. There was another film about children in Gaza during the last war, and I think this is something we should see and think about, and it was banned from being showed. Now, it's very problematic that we are able to see only things that we, the majority, like. So these are questions that we address, and we are getting criticism on this, that's right.
Well, it's interesting because in a way, ACRI has a position that is maybe even more restrictive of freedom of expression. In the United States, we generally allow hate speech as long as it doesn't go over into a call for violence. I think you articulated your position as not going so far as to embrace hate speech or incitement, and of course, part of the question becomes who gets to judge what constitutes hate speech or incitement. But it sounds like in those instances, there's a real incursion into the sphere of artistic and cultural expression that is of concern.
I think it has to do with, as I said before, with the neighborhood as well in the context. It is hard, there are many. I'll give you an example. In ACRI, we work Israeli Jewish lawyers and Arab lawyers together, Israeli Arab lawyers, and at a time like this, we're all working for the same mission, the same idea. But it's hard. We have different constituencies in many ways, and some of my lawyers that are, they look like me, they hold liberal views. For them, they can be identified as Jews when they go in the public sphere, and it might be dangerous for them. But when they speak with their kids that they're very worried about, they speak with them in Arabic, which is dangerous as well. It's very complex. It's important to understand, but even at a time like this, I think it's important to have a spine and something to refer to and to keep your normative values.
When you talked about speaking to your children about this, and you mentioned earlier the Gaza war, I understand that one of the big initiatives that ACRI undertook was an educational initiative right around the time of the war. Tell us about that.
So we're doing two things. One, we're defending human rights, but the other thing is to promote a discourse of human rights, because the work in court, I'm a lawyer by training, the work in court is definitely important, but it's not enough in order to create a social change. You need to use a wide toolkit. So when the war in Gaza last July happened, we were very worried about what is happening there. But as I said, we were very worried about what is happening in Israel. And the head of our education department, who's a Palestinian Israeli, was saying, we need a toolkit for teachers that by September 1st, when teachers are going to be back in class, we need to give them curriculum, classes, what to do. We asked for an emergency grant for our biggest donor, who's the NIF, the New Israel Fund, and we got within a couple of days, and we were designing classes. So until September 1st, the first day of school, we realized that 1,400 teachers were downloading free from our website these classes against racism and about promoting freedom of speech. And 800 of them were completely new to us, not on our lists. So we realized we have something that there is a need out there for. And so we are working against the government when it comes to court, but we are working with the Ministry of Education when it comes to educating the population. So I think in terms of social change, we're trying to use a variety of tools.
One of the wonderful things about the World Affairs Council is we really invite and encourage people in the audience to share their questions as well. So I've been handed my first batch of blue cards. And in fact, the one on top is one to which your last answer was very responsive, because the question was, in addition to your litigation strategy, or what we would call here impact litigation, litigation for social change, what other steps is ACRI and other groups taking to help increase people's appreciation of diversity? And I think that educational initiative you mentioned is a great example of that.
I want to say that, we're an NGO. As a civil society, to expect us, an organization of 50 people, to change the whole society, I think it's a wishful thinking. But the main thing to influence is the government, the main mainstream organization. And we need definitely to involve more people in what we're doing. And we do have a public outreach department. We do have a website and Facebook, and we do operate our education. But we're always thinking, what else can we do? Definitely, we need to use a variety of tools.
I had another couple of questions that relate to an area of work of ACRI's that I know is very near and dear to your heart, and that's a lot of the work that you do on behalf of low-income families and socioeconomically marginalized groups. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the work that ACRI does in terms of things like access to basic services.
So Israel traditionally, it's welfare society because we adopted the European model of government. But in the past couple of years, we see less safety net, less than it was before. So today, the statistics speaks about 1 of 3 children are under poverty line, which is quite a lot. We're dealing with affordable housing, with health services, a big success that we had a couple of years ago, that there is free dental care for children under the age of 12. This year we had a big success about access to water, assuming that water is a basic right, to having clean drinking water in 2015. So we were addressing the water authority. Their policy was to disconnect people from water if they had debts. So we were asking to change the policy, that it would not be a default, that there will be a committee examining the reasons why the bills were not paid. So there is a whole process that the default was changed. There's a lot to do about it. The welfare system, the allocations, the support the government is giving. We addressed in Supreme Court the question, what is dignified existence? And there's no clear answer for this as well, but I think it's important that it's in the public arena to discuss these questions, because we cannot take it for granted that everybody is having every services.
And so when you talk about your successes in this area, some of it I gather is through cases that you brought at the Supreme Court. And how about this example with the Water Authority? Was that something that you achieved through litigation, or something that you were able to advocate for in other ways?
So I want to say something about the Israel court system. So like here, the High Court is a High Court for appeals. So you start from a lower circuit and you go up. But there's another system that directly you can go to Supreme Court, known as Bagatz in Hebrew, and these are in landmark cases, in principal cases, in policy, and we have, as a human rights organization, we have the right for standing, so we can go directly to Supreme Court. The idea is to give access for the public, so the fees are not even that high. You just have to practice well, because it is Supreme Court. But so we go directly in some of the cases. Sometimes we can go with no clients on the principal matter. We do tend to go with clients, because I think my personal experience litigating a couple of these cases, that when you have a specific client and you have the normative level, you can show the specific examples. So what we did with the Water Authority, it was before we got to litigation. We were having corresponding with the Water Authority. Obviously, you need to address the authority before you go to court, and we managed to solve it before litigation.
I think the idea of direct access to the Supreme Court with public interest standing is something that a lot of U.S. lawyers are going to get very excited about when they hear about that. I also have an interesting question here, and maybe this will lead us into a little bit of a discussion of the current situation of both refugees and economic migrants and all sorts of people. Of course, this is an issue that we're confronting in many parts of the world, certainly in the Mediterranean and in Europe, but Israel also is on the receiving end of a huge influx of people from its war-torn neighbors. And I'm wondering if this connects with another question that I got about the Jewish value of tikkun olam, and if you can talk about that value, either separately from or in connection with your work with refugees.
The Jewish value of tikkun olam comes from the Bible, originally saying that you have to care not only for your people. I think it goes in the same line with human rights values, dealing with minorities. So in terms of refugees, the story was like this, I think, or the way I see it, that, as I said, there was occupation in 1967. Most of the services in Israel were done by Palestinian refugees coming into Israel. After the first Intifada, which was 1987, which is the uprising of Palestinians against the Israeli occupation, Palestinians were limited from getting into Israel. And Israel started in the beginning of the 90s to import migrant workers from around the world, giving them permits to come to Israel to work in constructions, in services, in caretaking, in agriculture, in many fields. But as I heard, there was a documentary saying we imported workers, but we end up with having human beings. And these people, they fell in love, they started families, and they settled. And there was a whole questions that ACRI started dealing in during the 90s about the rights of migrant workers. What do we give them? what is the framework for their rights. So this is something we were dealing during the 90s and the beginning of the millennium. And then we started having refugees. So the State of Israel was supporting the Convention on Refugees that started in 1951 or 53. And but when it came to practice, we were not very welcoming. So in 1977, we gave status to some of Vietnamese refugees. But since 2005, we have many refugees walking from Sudan and Eritrea, walking the border via Egypt. The regime in Egypt collapsed, changed in 2011, and these years, between 2005 and 2012, over 60,000 people were walking that border. So we had lots of refugees. Now, the question is, how do you treat refugees? According to international conventions, you have to check their requests for asylum seekers and to give them shelter if they're really refugees. But until 2009, we were not dealing with it. So UNHCR was the body that was examining the requests, and very, very, very few people were managed to be recognized. Later on, Israel built an authority that had to go over the requests, the asylum seekers' request. But the truth is that until today, 0.02% of the requests were approved. Just to give you a referral, the European Court was criticizing Greece for approving only 20%. Okay, so we are not good in this, and because we as a state did not want to violate international law, there was this system that decided there will be a facility, a detention facility without deportation. So this facility is in the desert, pretty much far from the center of Israel, and it was not considered to be jail, but people should be signing in there 3 times a day. So basically they couldn't get out of it. We challenged it in Supreme Court 3 times. Everything is online, but basically in last August 2015, 1,200 people were released from this facility. It's not the end of the story. There are lots of international implications, but in general, as a country that experienced being refugees ourselves in our history, we would expect, we as a human rights, ACRI as a human rights organization, would expect the State of Israel to treat refugees in a more serious way. This is right. It's true that not everybody is a real asylum seeker, and some people are hitchhiker, or you call it whatever you call it. But the main thing that some people are really real refugees that are facing death in their home countries, and the State of Israel should have addressed it in a better way.
I think those numbers are quite striking, and as we all know, every country is under an obligation to give refuge to anyone who has a genuine fear of persecution in the country that they're fleeing. So, of course, the trick is in figuring out who has a well-founded fear of persecution, but it sounds like, from what I understand, these detention facilities were designed to encourage the quote-unquote voluntary departure of people who wanted to apply to have their claims evaluated.
Yes, and Supreme Court said clearly that there is no detention without deportation. So detention had to have some idea behind it, but here it was really to make people lose hope and sign that they want to go back to wherever they're going. Nowadays, many refugees are being moved to a third country that we learn from the papers that it's Rwanda and Uganda. But here we have refugees in orbit. They're moving to another country where they're refugees and basically started walking or going north from there to Europe.
And what was interesting, and many of you may know this, but the law in question that you mentioned that ACRI has challenged so far 3 times, you may be back again before the Supreme Court, it's got a name that was very unusual to me as an English speaker.
Yes, we use the term refugees, but the law in Israel is called anti-infiltration law. So they are being treated as, even in the name, is different, yes.
Well, there was a wonderful passage from one of these decisions that you obtained in September 2013, and I thought I'd just read a passage from that decision. It says, "Hard as the task with which Israel is forced to contend might be, we must remember that those who are already within our gates are present among us. They are entitled to the right to freedom and right to dignity conferred by the basic laws to every person." And I thought it was very powerful language. That said, it does seem like the Knesset, the legislature, Israel's Congress, keeps coming back with modified versions of the law that don't squarely address what the Supreme Court has been saying. And so in a follow-up that you did, or your organization did on its website, we've talked at various points where there's an idiom out there about dialogue between the courts and the legislature that you may be familiar with. And ACRI said on its website, "The lawmakers in Israel are not engaging in dialogue with the judiciary, but are engaged in a no-holds-barred fistfight." That sounds a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, the idea is that there's separation of powers, and there's a lot of criticism about Supreme Court today from the right wing, and I think a democratic state should have an independent Supreme Court that can decide, and as it's another challenge we're facing in Israel.
But let's play devil's advocate here, because I do have a question on one of my little blue cards that takes us a little bit farther down that path, because it mentioned this attempt to sort of push back against what are viewed as overly liberal or anti-democratic court rulings, because of course the Knesset that is enacting these laws has been democratically elected. So what is the best argument for this notion that the courts are in fact getting too strong? Do you see any value in that argument, or is it really just infighting between, as we can imagine here in the United States, different branches of government, each of which wants to claim its share of power?
I don't know. I think we are losing so many cases in Supreme Court that it's really, I don't see it as very, I wish it was more active in defending human rights. But at the same time, I want the court to be independent and not to be part of the other branches, because here we are we're questioning whether this is democracy when there's no separation of powers.
And can you elaborate a little bit? I mean, what are there concrete threats to the independence of the judiciary now?
So it's it's different. The Supreme Court justices are being selected by a committee, which is supposed to be non-partisan political. Now, I know it's strange because here the politicians are choosing the judges, but the committee has members of the judiciary, members of the parliament, the Knesset, and members of the Bar Association, and it's supposed to be more independent. And now they're trying to change the composition of the committee, for example.
So we'll have to watch and see where those efforts lead. Let's talk a little bit more about the nature of the Jewish state, because I've gotten a number of questions, understandably, some of the issues that people who think about Israel, even without having all of the intimate knowledge of the issues that you have, think of sort of intrinsically. We think, okay, we have an idea of democracy. How does that square with the notion of a country that was founded in order to protect a religious minority? Do you see trends in how secular or religious Jewish Israeli society is? How is that playing out in terms of the dynamic now as compared to maybe 20 years ago? What is the secular character of the Jewish state as opposed to its democratic character, if those things are separable?
So the big difference is what is known as law of return. So the law of return allow any Jews around the world to get immediately citizenship in Israel for 3 generations. This law does not apply to our minority that are citizens. They have to go through a different system of naturalization. And that is being held now for it's being stopped. There's no family reunification for spouses of Palestinian origin since 2003. We challenged it in Supreme Court. It went to a wide bench, and we lost.
And when you say a wide bench, I understand that unlike in the United States, your system is more like the Canadian system, some other systems where sometimes a few judges can hear a case, and sometimes in an important case you would have the full bench or the grand chamber. Different countries call it differently.
We had 11 judges on this case. Yeah. Usually it's 3, and we lost 5 to 6 in this case. And this was it was introduced originally in 2003 as an interim, just for the time it's going to be, because they said, security reasons do not allow us to screen at all requests for family unification. Now we're 2015 and it's still going on. And it means it separated families. There are families that were already in the process of unification, and suddenly, sorry, dad cannot come home anymore. And this is heartbreaking, and it's the right to have family towards the right to security. How do you compare? So there are lots of implication to the balance between Jewish and democratic state. It is hard. Definitely, there was more times that Israel was more progressive in terms of human rights. The past couple of governments are more nationalistic on these things, and frankly, I think the current violence, wave of violence that I do not justify by any means, any violence, but in a way it didn't come as a surprise, because we feel that people are not having hope in terms of getting the rights.
I also had a question, and maybe a more technical question, but just about our use of language, which obviously is so important. One of our audience members wanted to know, why is it that we use or tend to use the word Arab Israeli for individuals of Palestinian descent who live within the 1948 borders, whereas we would use the term Palestinians more often to refer to those who live in the occupied territories? The question was, aren't they all Palestinians? Are we drawing some sort of distinction that doesn't really exist? What is your perception of how these terms are used and what their significance is?
So culturally, it's the same families. I'm thinking about the village of Barta that was divided in the middle. So half Bartas are Israeli Arabs, and the other half, who are their relatives, immediate relatives, are refugees. So cultural, we're speaking about the same families. Most of the refugees fled from Israel in 1948 and found themselves, when the country was established, when the state was established, found themselves out of the border as refugees. Those who were staying found themselves as citizens. So I, as a Jew, I'm not the one to define them, but I guess it's individualistic, but I sometimes tend to call them Palestinian Israelis and sometimes Arab Israelis, but we are speaking about the same culture, families, relatives, and yes.
So let's talk for a minute about what you see as the future path, so both the near term and the longer term. Of course, none of us has a crystal ball. I guess the movie Tomorrowland, if you've seen it, suggests that it's probably a good thing that we don't have a crystal ball, because pessimism can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But given that you've been here for 2 weeks now, I know you are far from your family. It's been a long and tiring trip. The headlines from Israel have been very distressing, I'm sure, to everyone following them, and no doubt even more so to someone whose family is there. What can you tell us both about how you're feeling right now, besides tired, and what are some of the concrete steps, some of the concrete goals that you have in both the near and longer term?
So there are a couple of things. This current wave of violence started actually in East Jerusalem. I didn't speak about East Jerusalem. I was speaking about Israel citizens and about occupied territories refugees. But there's a third division, East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem was part of the occupied territories in 1967, but it was annexed. The meaning of annexed, that its residents got a different certificate. They're not refugees, but they're not fully Israelis. They're residents of Israel. It means that their ID looks like mine, but they cannot vote to parliament. They can vote for municipality, and they're taxpayer. So it's a weird combination. And the truth is that we apply, when we defend them in court, we apply the Israeli law because it's part of the constitutional, as I said before when I spoke about the division. But when they look about their lives, they're far from being equal. We have a group working in East Jerusalem. We have a East Jerusalemite lawyer and a field worker, and their life is really hard in comparing with West Jerusalem. We have one case about having the same number of classes in East Jerusalem as in West Jerusalem. This is something easy to prove because it's budget allocation, right? And we say there are not enough classes for children in this part. So people are, gathering frustration. And that's how I think the whole situation has evolved, because it's impossible to keep people, as I see it, under discrimination for a long time. What gives me hope is the work of my organization in the past 2 weeks. While I'm here, we're going over the thing and gathering all the things, and we are seeing things that are bothering us very much. There is this week, 2 days ago, the government suggested stop and frisk policy, that people can be stopped in the middle of the street and being searched. And this is not a democratic step. We see also change in the in rules of engagement of opening fire. So the rules are saying first you have to warn the person, right? And now their leaders calling to shoot immediately every suspect. And we all already witnessed this week mistakes. I'm not speaking about mistakes. I'm speaking about the idea that you shoot people in order to kill without having a process. So these are things that we have to stop, although things are bad. And I think the leadership, as ACRI addresses this week to Attorney General and other leaders, saying, if this is a democracy, and it is, we assume, so you have to do 1, 2, 3, and there's a price for everything. So I do gain hope for the wonderful work that I see that is being done in my organization. Although it's hard these days to work Jews and Arabs together, it is challenging. But I think we're looking at the future. Me having children, some of my friends, having and thinking about the generations. We're speaking about millions of people that are living in this region together. So, assuming none of the people are going to voluntarily disappear, I think we'll have to find a path to solve it, because, frankly, we don't have another option.
Well, on that note about children and the hope of the future, I'm looking around the room to see who this question came from, because I find it so impressive. It says, what could I do as a 14-year-old to get involved in ACRI and in human rights in Israel?
Okay, great. So thank you. And, we have a website in English. We're having lots of volunteers. I think my main consideration, being very happy to be here at the World Affairs Council, is that people will be more knowledgeable. Okay, the situation is not black and white. When I'm being criticized, how can you criticize the government of Israel? I think I'm pro-Israel, because for me, correcting things is really important. And it doesn't mean that I don't have the right to criticize my government. When you have a kid that is doing something bad, you don't embrace them and saying, you're wonderful, you're great, your duty. And that's how I see my duty, is correct things. And if I think that Israel should be a democracy, it should act like democracy as well. So be involved, be knowledgeable. I'm glad that you are here. And we have volunteers. We have different. Go on our website. It's ACRI, Association for Civil Rights in Israel. And sometimes it's hard from the States, but we do involve people. Get on our newsletters, and we need support.
Well, you've got about 10 more minutes in the program, so I definitely invite more questions from the audience. And I have a few here that I'd like to continue with. And given that you are in the United States, perhaps you can talk. You already let us know, of course, that in this digital age, there's lots that's available online for us to learn more about your work and the situations that you're confronting. Maybe you can take a step back and talk about U.S.-Israel relations a bit more generally. I mean, of course, on the one hand, most Americans don't speak Hebrew, but most Israelis speak pretty decent English. And so there are a lot of course, Israeli government officials and business people and so forth who come regularly to the United States. The U.S.-Israel relationship is one that has been the focus of a lot of our pre-presidential election posturing and discussion. So it's certainly an issue that is important to both political parties in the United States. How does the sort of idea of a U.S.-Israel relationship affect your ability to do human rights work and the notion that we want to both support the state of Israel, but not, as you say, turn a blind eye to ways in which it can better live up to its own ideals?
So I'm a human rights organization. I represent not a politician, so I'm not going to get to any remarks in politically it should be this way or other way. I don't get into the solutions if it should be one state, two state, whatever. I mean, I have the privilege not to deal with this. That's the choice I made, but obviously there are other things. Lots of our support is coming from the U.S., from U.S. Jews mainly, but we do get support from the American government on our education programs in building capacity for democracy, and from Europeans as well. So not personally, institutionally, we are in touch with the ACLU as well. We're sitting in a body called INCLO, International Civil Liberties Organizations, with 10 other countries around the world, trying to figure out what are the things that are interesting for everybody in terms of human rights. We're doing surveillance now. We're doing non-lethal weapons, which are the rubber bullets, for example. So we're working.
And by doing, clearly we're talking about examining the legal ramifications of not conducting.
No,
Otherwise, I'm going to have to look for the bug underneath my chair here.
That's my English. I'm sorry. Yeah, doing means we're dealing with the legal framework and how can we minimize the use of this. This means in defending human rights. So we are trying to figure out internationally. Basically, the ACRI is operating within Israel. So we address our concern to the government of Israel as a first tool.
It makes me think about the transnational dialogue that is so important in so many of the areas that we all confront and that the World Affairs Council is obviously preoccupied with, that is both good and bad in a way if one is aspiring towards a more rights-promoting future. So on the one hand, I think of the examples you mentioned of the ACLU being a model for ACRI, of the freedom of expression jurisprudence of the United States making its way over to Israel, of Israel promoting things like basic access to services that, although are less a part of the U.S. constitutional tradition, are certainly a part of the constitutional tradition of countries such as Canada and South Africa. At the same time, we see countries today borrowing not so good technologies and precedents from each other, and including in the areas you mentioned, such as surveillance, such as construction of border walls, and various legal rationales for things like targeted killing and the use of lethal weapons. So do you see Israel as a net importer or net exporter of these norms? Do you think there's some sort of global trend towards some of these dangerous features that you've explained in terms of cracking down on freedom of expression, seeing more nationalism, or are we, again, in a sort of a more
I don't know.
optimistic stance?
I don't know, but it's really important for me to say that we're not a grassroots organization. So what we have to, my job is to examine and to foresee what is the next thing that has to come from the fringe into the consensus, to be aware. I gave in the beginning the example of women's right? And we are asking ourselves, what is the next thing that should be addressed? I think the rights of the Palestinians is not addressed enough within Israel, the rights of the Arab minority, the rights of socio-economic rights, the rights to welfare and other things. And whenever we reach a place like refugees, we started nearly 15 years ago, and now there's so many organizations that are dealing with it, that we ask ourselves, okay, what is the next thing? So I don't know to say, because the world is changing very fast. We cannot rest on the laurels, say, okay, we did great job until now, we can rest, because there are always the next thing. So we have to be aware. We're questioning ourselves, our way, how to operate. We want to create social change. But if things that are not very popular, are we going to hide them for the public? Are we going not to touch them? It's easier for me as an Israeli Jew to deal with socio-economic rights and surveillance and other things than to deal with the rights of the Palestinians. This is the elephant in the room in a way, in the world of human rights. But I don't think we should give up on dealing with it, because this is the core of what we're doing. And as I said in the beginning, it's hard when you're defending minorities, you're not popular. On the other hand, this is the job.
Well, one of my other questions, and this will probably be our second to last question for this evening, and does involve modern technologies and their role. And so on the one hand, it's wonderful for us to be able to go to your website and see all the wonderful work that you're doing and see in translation into English many of the Supreme Court opinions and briefs and materials that you've put out. On the other hand, of course, as we all know, social media in particular has a very polarizing potential in which people end up creating echo chambers in which they are only seeing and reading and hearing very particular versions of events. And in fact, the headlines we've been seeing out of Israel do involve these sort of mutual recriminations in terms of who's inciting whom and who's telling the accurate story. What do you see as potentially the dangers of social media in fueling the kind of a distance between common residents of a single territory in Israel, and what could potentially be its potential if used constructively?
So I think the main concern about social media is the silos it creates. So there are parallel universes. So all the people that think like me are in my universe, but in the parallel universe, there are people that are thinking different. And sometimes you'll get one, the algorithm will make a mistake and you'll find yourself reading, oh, this is from a different universe. Now, it is a problem because, seriously, in terms of public sphere, it creates a shallower dialogue in terms of changing views. And this is a real challenge because you don't want to be only right about everything. Sitting in a closed room, holding hands and saying, we are right, it's great. It's not enough if we do not influence out there. And that's a real challenge. Sometimes, it's something hard. I'll give you an example. As I said, from the Gaza war last year, lots of people were calling. Suddenly there were websites calling to fire Arabs from workplaces because they wrote on the Facebook pages that it's not good to have a war, or they were criticizing. So what we did, we were just immediately publishing guidelines for employers saying, this is the law in Israel. If you fire people according to their views, you are exposing yourself to a lawsuit on behalf of the Equal Employment Opportunity Act. So I don't have a clear answer. It's technology. You can't ignore technology. It's not as if we say, okay, we're not cooperating with technology. We'll print only in the printed newspapers. It's irrelevant. So we have to participate in the game, and we have to learn how to work it. And we're doing our best. We have Facebook pages in Hebrew, Arabic, and in English. We tweet in 3 of them. But to tell you that we decipher everything, not yet. We have a project. ACLU have now a project that you have an app that you can photograph everything in demonstrations and send it immediately to them. We have now a project on ground training volunteers how to document demonstrations on the ground as well. But it's a constant, you have to innovate all the time.
Well, this is the perfect combination. We have a live audience here tonight and you in person, with great thanks to your family back in Israel that's been without you for 2 weeks. And of course, I understand we're being live streamed and will be played back again later. So we've got all versions of the information age here at our disposal, thanks to the World Affairs Council. So with one last question, and since our audience hopefully has had their questions addressed. a quotation that has always struck me and that is often discussed in these contexts, and particularly I think was highlighted during a very difficult time in recent U.S. history with the program of torture that the U.S. conducted in various sites, is a quotation from one of Israel's most well-known Supreme Court justices, Aaron Barak, who also is a frequent visitor to the United States and I think has been a central part of this transjudicial dialogue that we were talking about earlier. And in a 1999 decision on torture and the use of torture, which was banned in Israel by the Supreme Court, he wrote, "Although a democracy must often fight with one hand tied behind its back, it nonetheless has the upper hand." And I think that really captures much of what ACRI stands for, I think what you've been talking to us about tonight. But it does elicit the views of some skeptics that it may be a naive sentiment, that fighting with one hand behind your back simply isn't possible in some struggles, because if you fight with one hand behind your back, you might lose. So I don't know, in the last minute or so that we have, if that quotation elicits any reactions in you that you want to leave us with as final words.
So this is a case we brought to, ACRI brought it to Supreme Court, and it's hard, as I said in the beginning, it's easier to sit in a nice room in San Francisco and discuss human rights, but I think on the other hand, I mean, I have to, in the end of the day, each one of us has to look in the mirror and say what kind of society we want to live in. And are we going to give up on our human identity, or are we going to struggle for having a human identity, although it's hard. It's really hard. But looking back at the human history in the past decade, I think it's not an option for me to give up on the human identity, and I think it shouldn't be an option for anybody. And I think we can do better. All of us, and it needs leaders, it's need a lot of faith. But I believe in human beings, and looking at the future, thinking about the next generation, I think there is a struggle to life that we all want to flourish, and we have to give it a chance. Now, it's big words. It's big words. It's not easy to execute, to bring it into practice. But someone have to give it a try, because the other option is too bad.
Well, that's all the time we have for tonight. So on behalf of the World Affairs Council, I ask you to join me in thanking Sharon Abraham-Weiss for such an engaging discussion, and thanks to you for your questions.